Hello and welcome back to another Pendragon Foundation video. Today we're looking at something a little different and perhaps a bit surprising because when I talk to most people about visiting castles or going on holiday, it's typically in a positive way. Oh, where are you going on your holidays this year? Where are you going to get away from work from? How are you going to enjoy yourself in your time, off from work? And usually, when you discuss it, you talk about all the great places you've been, to the great castles you've visited, or the sights, and how you enjoyed the food and the experience of being maybe in a different country. And it's always seen in a positive or at least neutral way that that visit has no negative effects. It's only a positive thing. But there is a question about that. Is tourism actually a positive thing? Does it have any harms? Do those harms outweigh any positives they might gain from it? And that includes not just visiting other countries, it would include visiting castles and perhaps even more poignantly the way we live our lives more broadly than those holiday periods. And so in this stream we're going to look at some of those challenges around the way we think about tourism, what what kind of dangers it might pose, and perhaps a more sustainable and positive way of relating to the places we visit in the future. And to do that, I'm delighted to have on with me somebody whose work I have in the last month or so just devoured. I've really enjoyed on the End of Tourism podcast. Chris, welcome to the channel. How are you doing?
I am some edition, some version of well, Nathan. Thank you very much for having me today, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Not at all, not at all. And I guess where I wanted to begin was with your own story in terms of this topic, because I know you've written on it, and it's quite interesting because I think it will be helpful for people to understand how some going on a holiday isn't just a neutral activity. And
Mm,
I certainly saw that when you wrote your own story, how that you came to that sort of realization. So, would you mind just sharing that for everyone?
sure, yeah. I mean, I guess to start, I think it's important to, for me, anyways, in all the work that I've done around the subject, to try to not ignore and not deny the existence of quote unquote good or bad consequences of tourism. But I think if we stay there too long between these notions of good and bad, as if it's a zero-sum game, then we can typically, you know, um, we neglect what's below the surface. Uh, we we forget the capacity to, or we forget the capacity of how we might think a bigger thought, as a friend of mine says. So, and that, a lot of that came to arise out of this strange path that my life has taken over the last 20 years, I guess. So I grew up as the son of immigrant parents in Toronto, Canada, and there was a general sense of kind of lingering alienation as a teenage boy, as many do, as many have. And when I was 19 or 20, I began traveling, and this became kind of a way of not only kind of ignoring the relative alienation, lack of belonging, I guess you could say, as well in Toronto, but a way of quote unquote discovering the world, right? So I became very much addicted to what today we call wanderlust. And most of my life, my days in my 20s, were spent working in order to travel, and of course, traveling. So over the course of almost a decade, I traveled, I can't remember, 20, 30 different countries, probably twice a year at least. And, you know, the more I did it, the more I realized it was an attempt to try to get as far away from home, or what I considered home, but somehow lacking a sense of belonging, um, was. And so at the end of that decade, I decided, well, all right, I'll just move somewhere permanently, and that'll be it. That'll kind of solve the issue, right? And so I did, and I moved to what is currently my home. It's been my home for the last decade, Oaxaca, Mexico. And almost immediately, I began working as a tour guide, we might say. A storyteller in training, certainly, but definitely part of the tourism industry. And it was fascinating for a number of reasons. One, because for someone who was a tourist, a kind of part-time backpacker for so long, it was really amazing how suddenly, out of the blue, I realized how much I hated doing what I was doing. Um, and of course, there's the obvious things, the bad behavior from tourists, the kind of lack of etiquette, the lack of cultural understandings in terms of where they are in any given moment. The obvious things. But the less obvious thing was how could I not have seen this over the course of the previous decade, right? Suddenly I was now working in tourism. Suddenly I was now working with people like myself who were traveling, for X, Y, and Z reasons, and couldn't see the consequences rolling out in front of me, my own bad behavior and lack of etiquette and so on and so forth, right? So it was really difficult, and on some level, and certain decisions made, like, okay, well, if we're going to continue working in tourism, this has to be something that, on some level incorporates the capacity for people to understand their relative degree of ignorance, right, in a place, especially in a foreign place, which we all have. And often in local places too. This is the thing, right? That affects so many of us today, is that we are also strangers to the places we call home, which was so much of the part of the reason, or one of the reasons, anyways, that I left and kept leaving the place I was born in. And so after a few years, I decided to start researching the history of tourism, and I started to write a book, a manuscript on the unauthorized history of modern travel, we'll say. And then the pandemic hit, right, in March of 2020. And this place that I live in, Oaxaca, Mexico, is very much a tourist town, very much a tourist destination, and has grown to, kind of epidemic levels in that regard, and of popularity and otherwise. And of course, the streets emptied out. There was no more tourism, and for the vast majority of people here, there was no more income. There was no more money. There was no more opportunities to offer up or engage in what we might call radical hospitality. So, it was a moment that I recognized needed to. How can I say this politely? We're mostly English crowd, right? English audience. So I'll put it this way: we had only maybe 6 months max, I would say, here in Oaxaca, of empty streets, probably less actually. But Mexico was one of the only places in the world where there were no travel restrictions. In terms of people coming in, and in terms of them, needing to be tested, or having vaccine requirements, or anything at all. And so, for political reasons or otherwise, many people, especially from our neighbor to the north, decided to essentially use Oaxaca, among other places in Mexico, as kind of escape routes. And what you saw quite a bit was it was very clear the people who on the street, the people who lived here, and the people who didn't, and the basis for it was essentially those who lived here were wearing masks, and those who didn't live here or who were visiting weren't, right? And the politics aside, it was clear that there was a lot of people, a lot more people here than in other parts of the world that were getting sick and dying of COVID. And of course, there was a large number of people who were arriving kind of, with their proverbial fists in the air, chanting, this, okay, freedom, freedom. I've been liberated from my totalitarian government. And of course, what are the costs of that? And so in 2021, I started planning with a number of friends a podcast, a way of kind of delving into the deep complexities around the histories, not only of tourism, but of migration and hospitality in general. So pretty broad themes, but trying to unearth what often lies hidden under the kind of broad stroke, the ways that people understand these subjects or these themes. For example, on the left, migration is always a good thing, right? Almost always, anyways. And then on the right, it's almost always a bad thing, right? And the same thing with tourism. Tourism is often the reverse in these contexts. So I launched the End of Tourism podcast, and it's been a way for people like yourself, people around the world, to meet different activists, authors, storytellers, neighborhood representatives who have a keen and dedicated eye towards the considerations and themes that they've either written about, spoken about, lived, etc. So it's a very strange path that this life has kind of offered me, and that I've decided to walk upon. And I think in terms of tourism, and certainly migration is part of it as well. The question often comes down to why is it and how is it that I couldn't see the consequences of my movements while I was moving, right? And I think that that's by and large the burning question that tourism and its advocates and its industry champions tend not to be able to answer. And it's not to say they don't have an answer. It's to say that the question itself tends to defeat our attempts to undo it, to subvert it.
I think that what you've just said, I think it will point towards many things in the upcoming conversation. I think one theme that came out was an idea of home and what it means to have a home, and maybe what we assume to be a home isn't actually a home at all. I think another thing that you've kind of pointed out is that the relationship between the tourist and the host is and the perceived differences, or the recognition of differences, tends to be weighted towards the host, and the tourist doesn't necessarily see those things, and that can vary on the nature of the relationship as well. I guess one kind of starting point, though, to kind of get a little deeper into this is when we're using words like tourism, I've often heard people talk about like under tourism, over tourism, touristification. There's a whole field of people writing about this kind of stuff. What do you think is the best way to kind of frame our engagement with it? And you've already mentioned a little bit about that we shouldn't have a binary good or bad or something like too much. Is there a danger, though, with something like over tourism, that we're maybe nullifying some of those strong critiques as well?
Yeah. I mean, when I say that, good and bad are superficial, it's not to say that there's not other ways of contending with these things, right? And of course, I think it's not only necessary. There's for many people in places like, especially in Southern Europe, but many other places like Oaxaca, it is mandatory that we try to understand the consequences of our movements and the consequences of the movements of people upon the places that we live in. And so, I mean, in terms of terminology, it's okay. I think it's okay to consider and reconsider these terms, but to not, I guess the way I like to say it is that we can be informed by these understandings. We can be informed by these terms or concepts, but we don't have to be defined by them. In the sense that the philosopher Bayo Komolafe's post-activism, he has this great question. It's kind of the central tenet of that philosophy, in which he asks, what if the ways we respond to the crisis are part of the crisis, right? So without creating a massive revolution instantaneously, which of course is often impossible, just to use these terms and concepts as apertures towards what's happening, right? Rather than submitting to them as if they're the only ways of understanding what's happening. And because of course there are many other apertures. The word there's often I often hear this kind of argument. Regenerative, sustainable tourism, you name it, rejuvenative, whatever, echo, all the things, all the kind of savior set possibilities. And, generally the understanding is that, well, we just need to create a better form of tourism. And, what if that better form of tourism was so different from what we understand to be today, to be the ways in which we travel in and to and upon and with the people and places we visit, that it would be called something else altogether, right? That it wouldn't be tourism, and it wouldn't just be something else. It wouldn't just be some new keyword that, oh, we're going to do this, right? But again, coming back to Bio's post-activism tenet, what if the ways we respond to the crisis are part of the crisis? That this has to be front and center in our understanding of the language that we use to respond to the crisis, because the language is the basis, in my opinion, my view, of how we contend with our world and the dilemmas that we face in our world. So, I mean, I wrote an essay on these considerations and the consideration around over tourism, and that there is no such thing as over tourism. There's only tourism and our inability to contend with it, right? That it's just it's, I don't know, it's there's certain things that I think that if we just contend with these considerations in the way that in this context of the possibility of the way that we come to them holds in it our inability to understand where the roots of the dilemmas, where the roots of the crisis lie, right? Then how to proceed, right? It just seems to me that whether it's in the academia, whether it's in the street, the way that people contend and consider and respond to the dilemmas of tourism and sure migration as well, tends to arise from the thing they wish wasn't so, and that there's a degree of imagination that is not only lost, I shouldn't say lost, but that's not only in abeyance from our ability to consider and court new worlds, but also our ability to contend with the ones we live in. In the sense that it's I think I'll just stop there.
No, that I think that's fair, and I kind of have an example, I think, of what you're talking about, because for a bit of context, I don't know if have you ever been to Britain before, Chris? Yeah, so you may know that a lot of cities now, and a lot of Britain is very touristy in terms
Mm,
of how it presents itself. Indeed, part of Britain's soft power, as it were, is its tourism industry, and being able to project its certain cultural aspects for people to visit from all around the world. I think of like Buckingham Palace and Big
mm,
Ben, and seeing the guards marching up and down, but then also somewhere like the Lake District, with its beauty and hills. But you go to the Beatrix Potter Visitor Centre while you're there and learn all about Peter Rabbit. Up to Scotland, where you get the kilt shops up the Royal Mile, and so on. And part of this is a consequence of post-industrialization. So what do you do to make money after industry has been uh, on the one hand decimated, but on the other hand also exported elsewhere? What do you turn to? And one of the things has been the tourist industry in a big
mm,
way. And one of the consequences of that, certainly in many cities, is in recent years there's been an increase of Airbnbs in city centres. So what would have been flats for rent for locals to rent, well, the landlords realize we can make a lot more money out of lots of tourists coming here, so we can change our flats, we can kick out the old tenants and make them into Airbnbs. And this has got many local people angry, and quite rightly, that they are angry, that they feel not only have they lost affordable housing in their town centres, but they feel they're losing their where they lived, right, for many years, and communities are being pushed to the margins. But what's interesting about that is the uproar has come in response to a specific symptom of the growth of tourism. And there wasn't such an outcry before the Airbnb aspect of it. If the Airbnb thing hadn't happened, I think a lot of these people would still be quite happy with this tourist heavy economy, or at least wouldn't be kicking up such a fuss about it. And so it's a very reactive response.
mm.
Um, it's that response to the symptom, rather than really thinking about, is this a good way for our economy and society to be so heavily reliant on people visiting these sites and paying money to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I had a season in of the podcast in Spanish because, of course, it was a really, really big deal. All these people coming during the pandemic, and it wasn't just your kind of average wintering population. It was probably twice or three times as much as that, and so there was a really strong reaction by the local population here, typically against the tourist, typically against the foreigner. And at the end of that season, I had a kind of summary episode with the young woman I was collaborating, and it struck me to say, as kindly as I possibly could, that where were you 5 years ago? where was the uproar 5-10 years ago when all of this was, beginning its slow march? Right. And one could take that, a lot of different ways, and probably a lot of different ways that are not, perhaps very friendly. But the thing is, if we don't understand what we couldn't see 5 years ago, if we don't understand what we couldn't see 20 years ago, how are we supposed to understand where we're going right now, or what we might expect to see or not expect to see in 5 years from now, right? Right. And so, and the pandemic is not an exception. Tourism, global tourism, and its infrastructure, didn't create a global pandemic, but it kept the doors open for one to happen, right? Undoubtedly. So, to say that something like that, something that might even approach the level of kind of deity in our time, something that, has this unrelenting kind of control over and kind of novelty in our lives, that it suddenly, is an exception to, oh, well, this happened. And so, it's just, we could have never predicted that. And it's like, well, actually, there were people who, who wrote books about this, and they were telling us, right? And so the same thing applies to tourism and where we're at, and where a lot of people are at in their home places. You look at Barcelona or Venice. Certainly London and Paris are up there. They're the top two in a lot of instances, but they're also major cities. When you look at much smaller places that have had tourism, have this really deeply adverse effect on it, or effects for decades. The model is there, and there's people who have written about this as well, who have kind of said, well, there's more or less 4 stages, and again, it's an aperture, right? So we can take this for what it's worth. It's a map. It's not the territory, right? But the map tries to describe the territory. So anyways, and there's 4 stages, and there's the the stage where people start to come, and there's this kind of it seems really good. It seems it's like, yeah, we could probably do this for the rest of our life, and without thinking of the difference, or potential changes, potential growth in the industry, as some might say. And then you have your place gets on the top 10 or top 5 lists, or things like that, and it starts to become popular. Maybe there's an airport now, right? Or maybe there's 2. And of course, tourism becomes massified, right? The masses start to arrive, and you start to see this very thing that you're talking about, right? In our time, anyways, in the last few years, the Airbnbization of a city, of a community, of communities, and of people's homes. Better understood as houses or investment opportunities, because I would make the argument that a home is not an investment opportunity, and an investment opportunity is not a home. And then usually what happens once the kind of massification occurs is, of course, you have this kind of this reactionary kind of pushback from locals, typically. Sometimes foreigners as well, but typically locals, and they're realizing that the investment, we might call it in scare quotes, that seemed like such a good idea 5 or 10 years ago, is suddenly leading to the loss of culture, the loss of language, the loss of any sense of community. And this is something that's become very clear here in Oaxaca, and in even just the last 10 years, right? An extremely quick period of time. And there, with some exceptions, there usually isn't, it's not quite a bell curve, right? It doesn't just crash and burn, because tourism, as you said, has become this kind of saving grace for the global economy to a large degree. Post-industrialization. And so what happens is a lot of these towns and cities tend to kind of plateau. not necessarily at the peak of, the tourism growth in a place. It might fall a little bit. And a lot of that comes as a result of people saying, like, oh, well, this place it's been massified. Why would I want to go there? Right. And then so instead they go to places that haven't yet become massified and just continue this feedback loop of the destruction, if you will. Of course, there's other ways of referring to it, but the cultural and often the cultural destruction of communities and cities and towns. And so this is, it's mind-boggling, because you see constantly, even in the last 5 years, it continues. The magazine articles, internet blogs, etc. Like, oh, like, you don't want to go to this place because it's over touristed, so go here instead, right? As if like you going there doesn't begin that process anew, right? And because people are like, well, I'm just one person, right? Like, who am I, right? And this was, although I didn't go to these places that I've mentioned, these over touristed places typically in my travels, me being there, my very presence on the scene contributed to the eventual massification of the places that I went to, right? And I had no idea, because most of the time I was there in these places for a few days, a week, 2 weeks at a time. How could one possibly understand the depth or breadth of their consequence in a place when they're only there for a few days, right? It's almost impossible. So to me, this is the part of the major dynamic that, not only tourism is affecting, but of course now, in concert with what is often referred to as gentrification, right? And more broadly speaking, the housing crisis or crises that are erupting all over the world in pretty much every major city, if not the smaller ones as well.
Absolutely. No, I think I was struck by a memory I have while you were talking, of my own experience of being a tourist on the island of Skye, a very beautiful place in Scotland, very sought after by tourists. It kind of has this uh, reputation of being somewhere you want to go if you want to get the real Scotland, as it were, the authentic Highland spirit. And we're driving around on these roads, which are not very big roads. They're not. They can only hold a couple of cars at most. Some are single track, and there's just tons and tons of cars and coaches. And we're all saying to each other, "Oh, if only there were less tourists here." And
Right.
there's that sense that, okay, we're part of this, but if we were here by ourselves, then it would be okay. But it's everybody else who's a tourist. They're the real problem, and you have that slight moment of, should I actually be here? But then it's more, it's the inconvenience to my experience, and I guess that that was something that I was thinking about too. Is it's like, okay, so why do I go then? If I had this
Mm.
awareness while I was there, why did I go again somewhere else? Why did I not think more deeply? And I think it's because, to me at that moment, well, maybe I just wasn't a very reflective uh, in that experience, but also in a way, it's precisely because it's an experience. It's a chance to enjoy myself and do all these enjoyable things, and that can range from something which is maybe a low pleasure, like sitting on the beach enjoying the sun,
Mm.
to going to a historic castle, or seeing a beautiful landscape, or going for a local delicacy to eat some food. It was all very enjoyable and something I can really throw myself into without the restraints of thinking I've got to go to work tomorrow morning.
Mm.
So it's all very entertaining. And the other tourists were an inconvenience because they were kind of ruining my uh, hoped for pleasure at the isolation of this island. I lost that chance of the maybe the authentic experience I had hoped for. So in a way, there was this kind of um, the annoyance came from that, rather than a full recognition of, okay, what would that actually mean for somebody who lived there? they must feel that far more than I do. And
Mm.
I'm doing it for entertainment purposes rather than, somebody who's lived there, their family lived there, and now the roads are blocked, and the sense of maybe the isolation, which was a part of their community, has now been totally taken over.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no way around it, you know, literally speaking, like not figuratively, literally speaking. There's a number of events here in Oaxaca that happen throughout the course of the year. Um, I would say like 4 or 5 major events in which most, no, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of the people I know, local people here in Oaxaca, especially those who live in the city or in the center, they leave. They leave, right? This is something that, 20 years ago would have been incomprehensible, right? They leave their own place because they can't walk through the streets. Um, and Oaxaca is not a big place, right? Like I have friends who've grown up and lived in Barcelona, and they have kind of little, what would you call it? Like they have ways of walking through the alleys of like certain streets that avoid all major tourist thoroughfares, so they don't have to contend with it, and just simply so they can get home or to wherever they're going in a decent amount of time. So there's that, right? I was thinking about the Airbnb thing today, and how the bubble that the Airbnb bubble that has existed in this city for the last, we'll say, 3 or 4 years, certainly a little bit before that, but really in the last 3 or 4 years is starting to burst. And with the addition of not only Oaxaca becoming kind of this place on the tourist map, it's reaching that plateau stage now. And what you see in the classifieds, where people are renting apartments, not to tourists, not on Airbnb, but for long-term tenants, is that almost all of them are furnished. Whereas 5 years ago, it would be maybe half and half, or even a lot more unfurnished, right? And the understanding is not only that, well, if this doesn't work out with this new tenant, I can just put it back on Airbnb, because it's just clear that this place was already an Airbnb rental. But on top of that, the aesthetic, right? So now that the Airbnb aesthetic, which is often imposed or at least suggested by Airbnb, right, depending on where you are in the world, that the aesthetic that is provided for tourists who are only there for a few days, who kind of want, or maybe expect or are expected to expect this kind of classic or traditional aesthetic of the local place. Now that kind of superficial, stereotypical aesthetic is now imposed on the local long-term tenants as well, right? And so the reason I'm saying this is because it's not only that you can't like walk through the streets in your own city or in your own town, but now you can't even rent a place that has its own quality. Everything is homogenized under this banner and composition of tourism. So, and there was one little thing I wanted to mention about what you said about I can't remember, but maybe it'll come back to me. Anyways,
I guess there's maybe another
I
aspect to this.
remember. If I
Oh, go
can,
ahead, Chris.
just
Go ahead.
quickly, the thing about you being in the Isle of Skye, right? And thinking, oh, if there wasn't all these tourists here, right? Kind of thing. I want, this is something that is so rarely considered. But I think it's important to mention is that this is also the kind of through line, the linguistic kind of protest, not only among tourists in kind of tourism spaces, right? But among migrants, but among local people in the context of migration, in North America, where I come from, in Anglo North America, this is the thing, right? It's the same thing stretched across generations, right? Younger people, or I should say, people who are whose great great grandparents or grandparents migrated to Anglo North America. In the context of anti-migrant sentiment in our time, this is also it's the same language, right? So it's fascinating, and I think it's important that we consider this, that in terms of our movements, the separation between tourism and migration, as two completely opposite things, has its consequences as well, and has consequences for our inability to understand our movements, not only at present but also ancestrally. That may be like a huge jump, but so I'll we can take a step back, and please,
No,
love to hear more
I mean, I think
considerations.
that's yeah, that's a really great connection to make, and I think actually a point I was going to make ties in a bit with this because again I was thinking of my time in Edinburgh. Now I have family very close to Edinburgh, so I always saw it as a bit of a part of my ancestral home, but I didn't actually have family in the city. Why was I there? To study for university, and the town, large parts of the town centre double up as both student accommodation and then in the summer it becomes tourist accommodation.
Wow.
And so you have this double movement into the city, as it were, of
Mm,
students. And most of the students don't come from Edinburgh or from Scotland, even. I think that I would say most come from England or the rest of the world. Um, England in part because it's cheaper than in England,
mm,
ironically. So it, but I as a student who was living in the city was feeling these tourists are coming into my city now and disrupting my experience of living here, not even thinking twice about the fact that I had moved there to study for a limited amount of time and not really embed myself in a local community. I may have been in a student communities of various kind, but not one that was integrated into the city's life outside of the student world. So yeah, there was that kind of sense of actually a internal or temporary migration and tourism are not they're not the difference is not of kind but of degree to an extent. And I was just really struck by that connection in itself. And so in a way taking a step back and saying, okay, these what we're seeing now in certain places might be the end point or a culmination of a process which doesn't even start with explicitly tourism as such, but our attitude more broadly to how we treat moving into places or our engagement with them. And I think on that point, I something that I've read you say before, or something you've written, is that we talk about home. This is maybe the word that's been lingering over a lot of this conversation. But what a home isn't just a place where you live. It's
mm.
more than that. And many of us don't live in a home as such. We certainly don't. And I use the word the community. What we mean by community is often very shallow and weak in terms of I say hello to my neighbor maybe when I see them in the street. That's not
Yeah.
a community, really. And so you've made the kind of provocative way of putting it is that actually many of us live like tourists in our own locales.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's looking back on the reasons why I was so keen to travel in my 20s. And I wasn't well off by any means. I didn't work. I didn't have even a great job, but I worked my ass off as much as possible to make those trips happen. And why? Like, where did this alienation come from? Where this sense of like lack of belonging, right? For to use another term. Um, and let me see if I can piece this together a little bit. What you're referring to, because I think it's really important. When I started living here in Oaxaca, and of course, in my travels as well, I met quote unquote expats, right? Again, another kind of, well, why don't we call them migrants, right? But anyways, people typically of the global north, typically they look like me or some iteration of that, that find their way to other countries to live, usually permanently, but we could say semi-permanently as well. And what I've noticed here and what I've heard, I think it's very, very common among quote unquote expat communities or scenes, is that like there's the common question: you meet an expat in your place, if you're an expat for the first time, and or migrant, and you say, "Oh yeah, so how long you been here?" Right? And there's this kind of it's kind of like a measuring stick, to put it kindly, uh, as a way that people have of deciding um, whether you have enough time in, right? Whether you're really of this place, even as an expat, which is not to say very much, given that most people in this regard are 5, 10, 20 years in a new place. And it's I haven't thought about this before. I haven't put two and two together in this regard, but there's an amazing book called The Uprooted by Oscar Handlin, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 1940s. And so this book came out in 1941. And it was essentially a social history on migration in the northeastern United States. And I'm sure it's very similar in other parts of the United States and in Canada as well. But, to kind of oversimplify what he was writing about, he would say that, well, the English and Scots and they were mostly there at the beginning, and then came the Germans, right, into New York City or wherever it was, Boston, and they were ready to work for less, and they were ready to pay more rent, right? Fucking Germans, right? And 10 years went on, and the Germans established themselves in their communities in the industrial cities and towns. And maybe the English and the Scots had went off and founded their own communities elsewhere. Or maybe they stayed, some of them, So half a generation goes by, and then come the Poles, for example, right? And they come in and they're ready to work for less, and they're ready to pay more rent because they just got there, and this is really a matter of survival in every sense of the word, right? And the Germans see this and they're like, fucking Poles, right? And so maybe they go off, or maybe they stay, right? But anyways, time goes on, and the Poles they establish themselves in the city, in the community, with their own little part of it. And half a generation goes by, right? And then come the Irish, right? And the Poles. Fucking Irish, man. They're willing to work for less. They're willing to pay more rent, right? And on and on and on, right? This is all turn of the 20th century up until the 1940s. And of course, if you look at what's happening today in the United States, especially, and of course, there's other places in Europe, in England, this is very much the case as well. It's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing, right? So the fact that this shows up among expats, right, and among tourists, as you say, is just like fascinating for me, and properly deserves a seat at the table as a way of wondering about where this comes from, where our way of moving, as tourists, right? Of course, in the mythopoetic sense, when we're talking about migration, I will speak for the people and places that I come from, which is largely European and the British Isles. But tourism is not, and you could say migration as well. It's not. It's not exclusive anymore, right? To people that look like you and me, right? And maybe it never was, but so there's this wondering, about like, what does it mean to be at home in a place when maybe by virtue of the places that we live in, and again, I imagine that there's perhaps a very different understanding of this in the cities and towns in England, where, you know, some of my ancestors, who might have been some of your people, right, don't didn't share, right, because they left, and because they came into places where everyone was from somewhere else, and therefore from nowhere, to a large degree, right? And that's a lot of what North America is. Anyway, so this is getting into deep waters here. But, you know, there is this sense that, you know, why travel the world looking for something that you can find at home, right? And people will say, oh, yeah, but the ocean. Oh, yeah, but the mountains. Oh, yeah, but this museum and that museum. And it's like, sure. But maybe there's something laden deep in or beyond or behind the thing that you're, quote unquote, searching for, looking for, you know, even if it's leisure, something as basic as leisure, something as basic as learning, right? If we take those things, the museums, the beach, etc., and turn them into really what they are, is to a large degree a hope, or hope for a lot of people, and the realization for a lot of people of either leisure or learning. We can start to ask ourselves, why is it that I don't feel that is present in my place, in the place that I call home? Or is it that, you know, it is in my place, I just decide to look for it elsewhere? And maybe I'm not deciding, right? Maybe that decision is being made for me by the dominant culture, by, you know, Instagram and the movies, Hollywood and everything else, that says that this is a good idea, and maybe the only idea, right? And so, yeah, I mean, you know, the housing crisis has such a huge part to play in this sense of homelessness, or cultural homelessness, right? In the sense that, I mean, I'm a perfect example. I've been in Oaxaca for a decade. I have moved houses or apartments 14 times, or more or less. Like, it's getting to the point where I can't remember exactly how many, right? And in certain instances, I was kicked out because the landlord wanted to turn it into an Airbnb, right? In certain instances, the landlord just wanted to raise the rent an astronomical amount. But regardless, you know, you end up with this sense of like, okay, well, if the vast majority of people move into a place and they have a sense that, okay, so a year from now, my landlord is probably going to raise the rent, right? Because it's their right by law to do this. And I probably won't be able to afford that new rental price, and so I'll probably have to move. Then what impetus do I have to getting to know my neighbors, right? Or like even saying hi, let alone, you know, organizing a kind of, you know, a dinner, or even, you know, something more more revolutionary, you know. And then dinners are very revolutionary. Don't get me don't be I'm not trying to mistake myself, right? But anyway, so, you know, just the hypermobility of our times is a deterrent from our ability to organize communally. So to, you know, maybe say, well, hey, you know, even like in the most kind of bland, you know, kind, polite way, as a community, maybe turning all these houses into Airbnbs isn't the right idea. Maybe raising the rent every year isn't the right idea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because there's no, you know, at the end of the day, you're courting resentment. You're courting resentment against, you know, the people who might supply you housing. You're courting resentment against the people who might be able to engage in some kind of intercultural conversation in which you might learn about other worlds, other cultures, other ways of being, other languages, right? And of course, we're in the middle of that right now. and yeah, it's hard to see any kind of way out at the moment, I think.
I wanted to add maybe another aspect to this, and then we can maybe look at a slightly different area. It strikes me as well that so we're talking about, you know, people being displaced, and so that's a the physical challenge of community that tourism poses in kind of disrupting that ability, and then also the desire to connect is also undermined by that fragility that's put there. I wonder as well, though, if and in a, whether the very nature of community seems to have changed with the emphasis upon choice and what I like, in the sense that there's a the yeah, and especially in the internet age, I think as well, but also prior, that actually the community, I don't need to connect with the people who live next door, because I can choose to connect with people who share my interests. I could choose to connect with people who think like me and enjoy the things that I like. And so that and also I guess with travel it's much easier as well to facilitate that as well as the digital. And so I don't have that kind of forced on me in the way that perhaps my grandparents who lived in this small town, and it was not so easy to travel away, were forced to connect with the people who lived next door, even though they might not have liked them at certain points or whatnot. There was a forced form of community which has its own challenges and hardships too. So I want, and tourism very much seems to me a kind of part of that, insofar as you choose where you go as well. So you choose where you would like to explore. It very much caters to your choices and what you can afford to do. It's there's no, you're not forced to go somewhere you don't want to go, unless you're the host, perhaps. So yeah, I wonder if that's a factor here, in that the very nature of community itself has changed in the last 100 years, I would argue. And so when you mentioned those communities earlier who maybe moved to America, for example, or moved to London, even 100 years ago, it tended to be to my mind, it tends to be a movement with several individuals forming a community somewhere else, who are geographically together now, in a way that it wasn't something like I've chosen to hang out with so and so because I like what they like, or I share the same football team, or something like that. But would you say that's like what would you say about that view?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of, I mean, I agree. In terms of what I just said about the kind of hypermobility of modern life, um, that it acts as a deterrent for our ability to know our neighbors at all. Um, there's a sweet old grandmother who at the local market where I lived. I lived in the neighborhood for like 5 years, and I would always go, and there was this kind of really sweet and after a time deep relationship that we built together. And then I had to move. Like I wasn't going to that market anymore for my produce, and it was just really, I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming. But absolutely, there's I think I luckily I have, I think, a certain amount of friends and colleagues that are willing to consider these things as well. So not always, but I would say that, generally speaking, the vast majority of people who I hear speak of community are not speaking of people whom they live with or around or near. It's typically demographic in nature, to the extent that, not just demographic, of course, in the sense of the obvious things, gender, skin color, age, sexual orientation, on and on, those obvious ones. But as you said, just general interests, right? And, you just, pick a political ideology, as, as major or minor as it might be, or a video game, and just slap the word community on the end, and somehow, that constitutes community. But what it really does is dilutes the possibility of what an achieved community could be. And it not only dilutes it, it impedes altogether the ability to imagine what that might look like, right? Because it's like, okay, here's your community, and it means almost nothing. Well, I shouldn't say it means nothing, but it can mean almost anything, right? In that sense, it can be anywhere, it can be everywhere, and of course, this is the basis for globalization, right? Everything, all the time, available to everyone, everywhere. And that it doesn't really ask anything of you, and I remember, when my grandparents were still alive, the ones who were farmers before they moved to Canada, they would tell stories. They would tell stories of the old country, the quote unquote old country in Macedonia. And yeah, like village life was crazy. And most people today wouldn't believe it. They would be like, well, how could you not kill that person, with in a serious question, right? And of course, I've been lucky enough to work in small scale indigenous communities here in southern Mexico for the last 10 years, and there's things about the stories that my grandparents told me that I recognize in the way that people live together here. And they're not going to work in the big cities. They're typically, they're working with particular group of people, rarely leaving the town, maybe once a month, kind of thing. So a village is a really difficult place. There's a lot of literature out there as well about how it was for our ancestors, and I mean this in a broad sense, whether in Europe or elsewhere, for urban people who tend to have, as I used to, a more romanticized idea of that. But I think there is a kind of impetus among urban people, among modern people in our time, to recognize the ease and access to everything, or many things that we have, especially as a result of the internet, and to contend with the ways in which all of these things are pushing us apart. Not just physically, yes, physically, and that's probably like the most, the basis, the fundament of our sense of alienation or lack of belonging, and to contend with these things in a way that subverts them. I don't think it's any coincidence that we're reaching this place in our day and age, politically, socially, economically, etc., where and ecologically, and on, where collapse isn't just a keyword, isn't just a kind of environmental prophecy. It is upon us, and that these aspects of dislocation, displacement, and everything, or many things being available all the time, have come to kind of a boiling point in the last 2 or 3 decades. I don't think there's any coincidence to this whatsoever. And so I think it's a, moral or otherwise, it's an imperative that we contend with this in a way that doesn't, it doesn't divide us further, right? And that is willing to contend, to err, to be wrong, right? And to be willing to be wrong, and to consider that the ways that we respond to the crisis are often part of the crisis. And I don't know you too well. I don't know the Pendragon's work too well, but it seems like a really noble project, and one that could properly take up this imperative, or this little mission that I've kind of provoked upon you.
I appreciate that, and I think it very much is part of our goal. And this actually gives me a nice pivot here to make a penultimate kind of question, because and I've got an image here to illustrate the point.
Mm.
This is Alnwick Castle in the northeast of England. It's a very fine castle going back. There's I think parts of it are Norman, but most of it is 13th century, and it's really a stunning location. And it was rebuilt by the Dukes of Northumberland in the kind of 1700s, 1800s, and so it's largely intact as a castle, which is quite rare for most castles in Britain. Most of them have a ruined aspect of some kind or another, and so this has meant that it's become the perfect place for filming. If you want to film your medieval drama or your Harry Potter, for example, they shoot it at Alnwick Castle. I think Game of Thrones has also had some stuff at Alnwick Castle as well.
Wow.
And so, of course, what that does is it brings tourism, lots and lots of tourism to Alnwick Castle. And this is what you're seeing on the screen is what the kinds of things they now offer at the castle. You can have your go at riding a witch's stick and play what's the game they play in Harry Potter? I can't remember now. Quidditch, that's the game. Chasing after the ball on your wizard stick. Now we might kind of chuckle at this and think, oh well, how silly, but there's a kind of deeper point here, which is that not only at Alnwick, which is maybe at the extreme end, but more broadly, a lot of castles, heritage institutions, these buildings have lost their original function, just as towns have lost their original industries, which gave them their rationale, the reason why people lived there. And so they're looking for alternative ways to sustain themselves. And that has very much gone in the tourist direction. And certainly Alnwick is very successful at that. It gets thousands of tourists every year, which helps sustain the people who work there and the building itself. But there is a twist to that, which is, on the one hand, what kind of relationship do you now have with this historic monument, and does it really belong to the people who live by it anymore when it's busloads of people coming in? And I think it becomes a kind of product to consume, or something to entertain you, rather than something to seriously engage with as part of a past, but also a future for that community. And at the same time, how would you put it? It kind of simplifies it down. There's questions around even the word heritage in this regard, which is often, heritage and history are not the same thing, and heritage can often be a kind of nicely packaged version, or to celebrate certain things and ignore other things. And so much of many of our castles kind of exist in that bubble, where they exist for a tourist experience and have no meaningful connection with anyone else's life. And so that history is no longer a part of your kind of living in a place, your home. It's cut off from it. So Pendragon's very much kind of we want to be very conscious of that when we're going about rebuilding castles, because we don't want to fall into the normal model of this sort of thing.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I don't know if I've ever actually visited a castle. I've been in England, I've been in Scotland, but I don't remember if I've actually ever visited a castle. But there's a number of things that we could consider. One is, in the context of this, especially for urban people, modern urban people, and the inability or kind of forced withholding of the ability to meet your neighbor, right? We could extrapolate that towards the context of buildings and castles. I'm sure there's Disney movies in which certain buildings are depicted as alive, as animate, as sentient, and having their own life. And so we could start to wonder about the way that the architecture of tourism is created and maintained in order that the life of these buildings stagnates, we might say, or exists in the context of this photo. Nothing against Harry Potter. I'm sure if I saw the movies, I might be interested, but that they also exist in these kind of simulations, right? Simulations that are born and bred for not just foreigners. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of locals in tourist locales, destinations, who go and experience these places as well. One of the things that I found in my research that I found extremely fascinating, and I don't know to what extent this is a pan European or British Isles understanding, or to what extent it existed in these places before the 18th century, 19th century, before the Industrial Revolution. But there is a consideration around ruins, right? Certainly castles continued to be used for a long time, but there was also much older ruins that went the way of all things, which is down. And so there was a lot of English and French courts in the previous to the 19th century, to the Industrial Revolution, that had old ruins in them, right? What we would consider today to be ruins, which is also linguistically a way of what does our manner of referring to these buildings as ruins do to them, right? So this is again, in the consideration of these places being potentially animate, right, of their own life, of their own history, a lot of people would say, and that those ruins were looked upon as being kind of inevitable, not victims. You could say that. You could say today we might say that, a lot of people, but inevitable food, inevitable food for the earth, right? And that those buildings were going the way that all buildings are going. And so that's not to say that I oppose in any way restoration or think it's a bad idea. There's so much beauty that's to be found in these buildings, but there's a lot of ways that we could, okay, like Harry Potter, sure, like you're going to get a lot of people showing up, right? And that's great, right? But what kind of activities, what kind of learning could we come to in the context of the dilemmas that we're living today, right? As if those things somehow don't exist in these places that we go to that seem to be like, places out of time somehow, right? Because, they all have this kind of simulated quality to them, of not having, much to do with the vast dilemmas of our world. But, castles were often built, among other things, for military defense, right? And so is that necessary, in the sense of coming to this question of what's original, as if original trumps all other possibilities? I think that we have to contend with that as well, because, maybe the militarization of our societies at this particular moment in time might not be the best idea, right? And I'm not saying that that's what you're suggesting at all, but that we do in terms, when people do think of tourism, there is this sense of how do we focus on what might be the most authentic, what might be the most original, and while there's nothing wrong with that inherently, we could also consider what might these places and our times together, separately, be asking of us. What might the walls of those places be asking us to remember that has since been forgotten? and maybe not just the walls themselves, right? The buildings themselves. And I am speaking as if, not as if. Um, we can't say, it's hard to say in English otherwise, but as if they're, of course, alive and sentient. But like you consider, like, for example, the church, the main church, Cathedral Square here in Oaxaca, and those churches took 100 years to build. They're so big, and probably to the scale of some of the castles in Britain. And of course, on this side of the Atlantic, that a lot of people were being employed, perhaps under false pretenses, perhaps for no pay whatsoever, to make that. And surely a lot of them died doing it, right? And so, that this is just one particular example, is that we could wonder, among the people who have died in and around these places, the walls and how they were built and why they were built, and the unconsidered histories that lay in the cracks in those buildings. What might be trying to bubble up, right? What might be trying to find an ear that might be willing to listen. So there's a lot of really kind of I guess kind of like plain and basic ways of wondering about these things and contending with them, and there's nothing wrong with that. Recreating a kind of banquet dinner on the lawns of that castle for the local community, perhaps as the rulers of that castle once did, only for the aristocracy, right? But instead doing it for the entire community. There's many ways to contend with this. But I think it's important that we do so under the guise of, there's no pretending anymore. Like the simulation and spectacle of tourism cannot hide what's going on in the world, and we need to be able to contend with it in these places and in these ways. And sure, and yes, not just with local community, people who might want to come and visit. And a question could be, are we, or you in the plural sense of the word, ready to host others, strangers, foreigners in your place, if you don't have a sense of what we is in a particular place, right? If there's no community, what kind of hospitality are you offering, right? Because radical hospitality means rooted hospitality. It means of that place. And if there's no we, if there's no community to to seed and care for and harvest those roots, then what are you offering the people who come? Where does that hospitality come from? Is it hospitality, right? So these are the kinds of things that kind of run through my head as I'm walking down the street most days.
Well, I'm very grateful for your thoughts, Chris, and I think this has been a really good, sometimes very deep conversation about the challenges of tourism and how we could maybe approach our homes in a more intentional and engaged way, and hopefully build better ways of living for ourselves, for our families, and, dare I say it, for our communities. If people are keen to find out more about this, where would you recommend they go? About tourism and how you were talking about radical hospitality. Where should people go if they want to find out more?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I would shamelessly promote the End of Tourism podcast. I mean, we're up to probably 70 or 80 episodes now on a really wide range of topics. Of course, radical hospitality, and a lot of this that we've kind of touched on today, being part of those discussions, those conversations. So that's theendofTourism.com. The End of Tourism podcast can be found on all major podcast platforms, and my own work and writing can be found at christu.substack.com. pendragon.foundation.com. And yeah, if anyone wants to talk more about this, I'd be more than happy. And including you, my good friend, I really look forward to seeing what kind of what comes out of this project that we're engaging in, and hopefully I can visit one day.
Oh, it would be great to have you over. I promise I won't take you around the sites, but we'll do it in a good way. We'll do it in a good way. But
Sure.
yes, it's been really great, and I'm ever so grateful to you, Chris, and everybody watching. Thank you for doing so. It's been great to have you. If you would like to support what we're trying to do with rebuilding castles and integrating them into communities, head over to pendragon.foundation and you can find out more about how you can get involved. And we've got lots of opportunities coming up ahead. Our next stream will be in a couple of weeks' time, and that's going to be with Shad M. Brooks, who is a big castle lover, and we're going to be talking about castle controversies. So look forward to that, everybody. But till then, thank you once again, and have a good evening. Bye for now.
Thank you, Nathan.